This is a production of Cornell University.
Hi, my name is John Hermanson, and I teach up at the other end of campus at the vet school. I was asked to introduce Bill. This was a couple moments ago, so I didn't really have any prepared comments, but I have pages of things I could tell you about him. He's kind of like having a bad teenager in the house. But it's been great. He did a PhD here. He's been gone, I guess, 10 or 12 years. And what's really neat, and what I've told a couple of people up at the vet school about Bill, is it's nice to see him take his scientific knowledge and turn it into a real work of art in terms of explaining it to people like me, everybody. And so the book has really been flying. It's only been out there about a month, but I know Amazon has been raving about it, and so that's a good thing for him, and I wish him a lot of success. Today, I know he's going to tell you a little bit, certainly not going to read the whole book to you, but he's going to give you a couple of snippets and some insights into all the great things that are going on in terms of vampire bats and bedbugs and chiggers. In that sense, it should be a lot of fun, so I look forward to this. Hope you enjoy it. We'll get him mic'd up and ready to go. There you go. Bill Schutt.
Hi. It's nice to be back up here. I actually graduated from Cornell in 1995, and it was kind of like 5 of the most fun years, hardest work. Never worked that hard in my entire life. I'd been out of school for a while and decided to go back to school for my PhD. I was working in the pharmaceutical industry, and this is when the pharmaceutical industry had money, then they were throwing it around, and I had this really cushy job as a researcher down in a place in New Jersey, and when I decided to go back to school and get a PhD in zoology, I sort of expected my friends and relatives to grab me by the lapels and just like, what are you talking about? What are you doing? But nobody did that, and so I applied to a couple of schools, and when I showed up at Cornell, it was the middle of the winter, and I met this young assistant professor. I would have been his first graduate student, and John said, "Oh, let's go take a walk. We'll go down to the dairy store, the ice cream store." So we walked down there, and of course it's completely boarded up for the winter. And that was sort of how we started. And once I got accepted here, it was kind of interesting because John had his grants were basically generated around doing work with mussels, and did a lot of work on muscle physiology in things like horses. But he had a real love for bats, and so it was a toss-up for about 3 seconds. Hey, Howie. It was a toss-up for about 3 seconds what I was going to work on, and I immediately decided that I wanted to work on bats. And it's kind of funny because 30 years later, people will look me up on classmates.com and they'll go, "So what do you do for a living?" And I go, "Well, I study vampire bats," and the general response is something like, "That sounds about right." I was the kid who had a monkey when I was little, boa constrictor, every strange animal. So no one was really too surprised when I wound up studying these creatures. So I came to Cornell, and I was lucky enough to work with some tremendously cool and intelligent people. That's not too much of a surprise. But the lucky thing for me, and as you'll see in my talk, is that there were 3 species of vampire bats, and 99% of what had been known about vampire bats had been reported about one of these bats. The other 2 were in a sense open books. So that allowed me to sort of waltz in and pick any aspect of research and do it in a comparative way. And I got a lot of mileage out of that. So I also hooked up at that point with the Museum of Natural History, and I got a postdoc there. And at the same time, I was offered a tenure-track job at a small school in New Jersey. And so rather than turn down the postdoc, they got sort of creative, and they decided to let me take the postdoc money and spread it out for as long as it would last, and I could take the tenure-track position. So it's just, that's the kind of luck that I've had, and the cool people that I've dealt with over the years. So a couple of years ago, I had the idea to do a book on blood-feeding creatures, and got talked out of it. And a few years later, I was able to, because of a novel that I'm writing, able to hook into this wonderful agent, Elaine Markson, in New York City. And while I was waiting for her to sell my novel, a friend of mine who was my artist for Dark Banquet suggested that I resubmit this book about blood feeding. So I did, and I was sort of used to the glacial pace of the publishing industry. And 2 days later, I got a phone call from my editor saying, well, we've got this thing now, and I've got a bidding war going between Random House and another major publisher that I will not name. And so over the course of the weekend, I just bid this thing up, and by Monday, I had sold this incredible book to, well, what turned out to be an incredible book, I think, to Random House. And it's been really easy to write and a lot of fun. So it's not a textbook, as you'll see, and I'm going to read a short section from it. This is a title. The title of this chapter is Of Mites and Men. The first time I visited Trinidad in August 1991, I brought along 1 pair of long cotton field pants and 5 pairs of shorts. I figured, hey, it's hot there every day. Who needs long pants? On subsequent visits to the country, or any tropical locale I happened to be working in, I'd bring 1 pair of shorts, reserved for walking around town if there was a town, and 5 pairs of long pants. The reason for the drastic wardrobe revision can be summed up in 1 word: Chiggers. As I found out, the easiest way to experience these tiny parasites firsthand was to wear short pants and sandals while walking through any grassy or wooded area. Unfortunately, that's just how I encountered them as I hiked the forest trails behind the Pax guest house where I was staying. It hadn't seemed like a bad idea, at least initially. It was probably about 90 degrees Fahrenheit with a humidity to match, and I'd snuck away from my lab work thinking that a walk under a canopy of green might cool things down a bit. The hike itself was uneventful, and in that regard, it was entirely different from my evening treks through the forest. Missing with the night sounds, layer upon layer of chirps, buzzes, and clicks, all set against the incessant drone of mosquitoes. With each nighttime walk in the forest came a growing awareness that the trees themselves were alive and covered with life, and this awareness brought with it a mild claustrophobia that was impossible to describe and never entirely went away. But now in the blast furnace of mid-afternoon, the forest was silent. Nothing moved. Soon enough, I headed back to Pax, convinced that any creatures worth seeing were also smart enough not to be out and about in such wretched conditions. After getting buzzed past the front door, I was confronted by Gerard, the guest house manager. Wildly funny and incredibly bright, he and his wonderful Dutch wife, Oda, run the mountaintop landmark as if they were born for the job. Gerard's only real personality flaw is that he hates bats, which was unfortunate for him since there were probably 30 species patrolling the rainforest right outside his back door. "And where have you been, young man?" Gerard inquired, his voice rising in a pitch that threatened to crack my sunglasses. Gerard refers to all males younger than the age of 88 as young man. And on a recent return trip to Pax, my wife Janet and grad student Maria were both disappointed to learn that Gerard had been calling them both Sugar Plum. "Just taking a walk," I said, trying not to drip on the exquisitely polished wooden floor. Gerard shot me a look as if I'd been out munching roadkill. "Whatever," he said, throwing me a good-natured but dismissive wave before hurrying past, presumably in search of more intelligent company. The next day I woke to find that not all of the forest creatures had been inactive during my ill-advised walk. Looking down, I could see a band of itchy red dots circumnavigating my waist like Magellan's diaper rash. After taking a hot shower, I slathered on some calamine lotion, but strangely, the itching just got worse, so that by that evening, I'd run through the entire bottle, exhibiting all the self-control of an addict on hot pink liquid crack. Embarrassed, I decided to keep my new red belt a secret. "I hear you picked up a few chigger bites," my graduate advisor and mentor John Hermanson mentioned over breakfast the following morning. Great, I thought. It must have been my question about whether calamine lotion came in a 5-gallon drum. "Yeah, no problem," I said with as much nonchalance as I could muster. I'm feeling a lot better." "That's good," he said, returning his attention to a plate full of eggs, "because they'll probably arrest you if you keep rubbing against the table like that." Over the next few days, the rash actually got worse, as did my desire to scratch the angry welts that had developed. I tried to get imaginative, imagining how I'd deal with this if I'd been stranded on an island somewhere. I found that by hooking my thumbs into my belt buckle and imitating some old Twistmeister, I could scratch all my chigger bites simultaneously. Almost as important, I learned that I could avoid bites altogether by wearing lightweight, long pants with the cuffs tucked into my boots. As for protecting my upper body, I found that an ultralight, long-sleeved shirt added the finishing touch to a relatively chigger-resistant field outfit. The key bit of knowledge, though, was not to go wandering around the forest or scrub during the hottest, most humid parts of the day. So, 18 or so years later, here I am talking about the book that sort of came out of all of this work, and I will now sort of tell you a bit about some of the creatures that I've encountered and some of the people that I've dealt with, and all of them were pretty amazing, and you couldn't make these people up if you tried. So blood feeding occurs in a fairly wide variety of creatures across the animal kingdom, from annelid worms like leeches, annelids meaning like earthworms or annelid worms, segmented worms. And one of the fun things about writing this book was I was able to write the Humphrey Bogart, Katharine Hepburn leech scene in The African Queen from the point of view of the leeches attacking Humphrey Bogart. Certainly insects like mosquitoes, fleas, and bedbugs. Mosquitoes I didn't cover very well because they had been done in so many books, but they are by far and away the nastiest of all of the blood-feeding creatures on this planet. And 2,000 children a day die from malaria, from mosquito-borne disease. So without a doubt, mosquitoes are the worst problem with regard to blood feeding. Then there are non-insect arthropods like mites. This photograph was actually taken underneath your bed. Yeah, these are dust mites, so I've cheated. They're not blood-feeding creatures. Dust mites feed on sort of the debris that your skin as it flakes off. And ticks, of course, and I'll tell you a story about what's happening in the Northeast with regard to ticks. Chiggers, which I just mentioned. This is a poster from World War II, and then there were some places in the Pacific Theater where chiggers and chigger-borne diseases actually killed more GIs than the Japanese did. It was a very serious problem. Here you can see it. Oh, you can almost see a chigger feeding. You might see that picture again later. And of course the vertebrates, like vampire bats. And finally, the Candiru, the most notorious probably of all of the blood-feeding creatures. All right, so this talk is going to ask a couple of questions. I don't know if we'll run 45 minutes, but how much stuff about blood-feeding creatures can we sort of pack in and interesting and gross things in 45 minutes? And the other is that besides the fact that these creatures exhibit similar diets, are there similarities that they share, whether you're dealing with a tick or a leech or a vertebrate like a candiru or a vampire bat? And as we'll see, there are. I'm no good at keeping secrets. The other interesting thing I was able to do with this book is, as the title implies, Blood and the Curious Lives of Blood-Feeding Creatures, I went back and looked at blood from a historical perspective. And initially I did this because one of the creatures that I was going to look at was going to be leeches. And I discovered that up until the early, just about the turn of the 20th century, bleeding and therapeutic bloodletting was something that was practiced all over the world, and especially in places like Europe and the United States. So rather than give you an aspirin and tell you to come back in the morning, you would normally be bled, and they would sometimes surprisingly large amounts of blood that they would drain from you. This all stemmed from the concept of humors. It was before people understood about things like bacteria or viruses or mental disorders. And the thought was that there were 4 humors that circulated within the body. There was yellow bile, black bile, the smoker's favorite, phlegm, and blood, and that by keeping these humors in balance, you could keep the body healthy. You could cure mental disorders. You could cure any type of disease. They would bleed people who drowned. They'd bleed you for a bloody nose. And to me, the most interesting story was that in 1799, George Washington, who had retired, he wasn't the president anymore, was riding around on a horse. It was a really nasty day, and came down with a sore throat. Went back to his house, was having some trouble breathing and speaking. So they called in the person who was the supervisor of the plantation where he lived, his farm, the person who ran his farm. And of course, the first thing that they decided to do was bleed him. So they opened up a vein and drained some blood. Well, Washington got worse and worse. So they decided to call in two physicians who were his longtime physicians. They'd been treating Washington for 20, 30 years. So they took a look at him and they knew that they had to act immediately. What did they do? They bled him again. And over a 13-hour period, they bled George Washington of 83 ounces of blood, which is about 40% of the volume of blood in a normal human. And of course, he died the next day. And I was blown away by this, at just how ridiculous this was that they killed the former president of the United States, the most famous man on the planet. And so there was an inquest after this was over, and I said, all right, well, here's where they're going to nail these physicians to the wall for what they did. And amazingly, when I looked at this, because I was thinking to myself, how stupid were they? This is ridiculous. I'm reading the inquest, and here were the complaints from the doctors. They said, you know, those doctors messed up. And I went, oh, here we go. And they said they should have bled him closer to his tonsils, because if they did that, that's closer to where the problems were. And I'm looking at this, and I moved down, and it said, yes, after they bled him from the tonsils, they should have wrapped a bag of salt around his neck. And I'm going, so the take-home message here is that they were utilizing the best techniques, the techniques that were tried and true techniques back then. And so they weren't really messing up. This is what they believed, how they believed they would treat people. And the strange thing is that if you could jump forward 100 years, and if Washington had died in 1899, they would have done exactly the same thing, except maybe they would have used leeches to bleed him. Leeches became very, very popular during the 1820s. Napoleon's surgeon, a gentleman by the name of Broussais, would put 50, 60 leeches on someone to bleed them. The ladies would wear clothes a la Broussais decorated with leeches. They were huge. In 1 year in the 1820s, 63 million leeches were used. And because of this, people actually made a living by taking their animals, old horses, old cows, bringing them out into ponds, and then having leeches attach themselves, and then they would pick these leeches off, and they would pick them off themselves, hopefully before they dug in too deep, and save them in baskets, and then sell them to not only surgeons, but to surgeon barbers. And that was something else that I found really interesting. Back in the 18th and 19th century, barbers didn't just cut your hair. They did things like changed wound dressings, they would bleed you, they did minor surgeries. And the barber pole that is still a fairly famous landmark, it was actually, the meaning of the barber pole, the white stripes were bandages. The red signified blood. The globe up on top of this, of this pole signified the bowl that they kept the leeches in. So yeah, so this went on through, right up until around the turn of the century, when people like Lister and others discovered that diseases were actually caused by bacteria and viruses, and other people did work with mental disorders. And so leech use dropped through the floor until the 1970s. And in the 1970s, surgeons were returning from Vietnam, and they were asking for supplies of leeches. And people went at hospitals, why are you using leeches? What are you bleeding these people? And the story is that leeches are now used for reattachment surgeries. And here's how this works. Let's say somebody walks into an emergency room with their finger in a bag full of ice because they somehow, unfortunately, sliced their finger off. So the surgeon is going to reattach this finger. And he's got to reattach the muscles, put the bones back together. But there are also blood vessels. And they've got to knit those back together as well. Now, the arteries that carry blood from the heart to this reattached structure are kind of thick, muscular walled structures. They're relatively easy. I say relatively easy because it's still microsurgery. Relatively easy to reattach. But the veins that carry blood from the structure back to the heart are very thin walled structures and almost impossible to re-knit. So what happens when you reattach a limb, an ear, a finger, whatever, is that blood can get pumped to that structure, but then it pools there because there's no way for the venous return to bring it back to the heart. So you'd get clotting and blockage and problems with that reattached structure. What the surgeons in Southeast Asia found, and this information they passed along to the Americans, was that the leeches, if you would attach leeches after a reattachment surgery, the leeches would draw off that blood before it pooled. And at the same time, the anticoagulants in their saliva would prevent the blood from clotting. So now there are industries, several different companies that raise leeches and sell them by the thousands. So I'm thinking to myself, I live on Long Island and I teach on the North Shore of Nassau County. I'm thinking it'd be great to talk to somebody at one of these places. And so I started to look in the phone book, and 10 minutes from my school was Leeches USA. And Leeches USA is run by a Holocaust survivor by the name of Rudy Rosenberg. He reminded me of Albert Einstein if he had a twin brother. The guy was absolutely hysterical and just the very, very gentle, super nice guy. And he told me all these great stories. He was on hand for the John Wayne Bobbitt combination reattachment enlargement surgery that was performed. Those of you who have heard about John Wayne Bobbitt, his wife sort of took the penal code in her hands one evening, and no, yes, you all know about that one, right? And a host of these really interesting reattachments, and so you couldn't make this. You just couldn't make up people like this, and I was really lucky all along the way learning about critters that were not vampire bats. That everyone I'd met and talked to was sort of the equivalent of this Holocaust survivor now running Leeches USA out of Hicksville, New York. All right. Bedbugs. This is probably the section of the talk that creeps out most people, and that's because bedbugs are apparently going to be the #1 household pest in the United States. Well, I was told in 5 years, but that was 3 years ago. And I just came from I gave a talk at a couple of days ago to a group of about 350 pest control people, and all of them were emphasizing bedbugs, that was the pest that they were dealing with the most. This is a bug that has had a major, major resurgence. And probably the only good news is that at this point, they don't transmit diseases. They just bite you. But people are just completely freaked about the fact that you're in bed and these things are biting you. And now, so I want to talk about them for a little while, and I want to talk about the reasons why there's been this resurgence, and then I want to give you some hints as how not to get bedbugs. Well, bedbugs, what are they? They're, yeah. They are arthropods, things like, that means it's got a jointed outer skeleton like crabs and shrimp and lobsters and spiders and scorpions. And the insects, of course, are the largest of that group. And within the insects, there's a certain classification that are literally called bugs. So it's not really correct to call everything a bug. That would be like calling all dogs chihuahuas. You know, it's the other way around. Chihuahuas are a subset of dogs. By the same token, bugs are a subset of insects. So why this resurgence? If I could boil it down to one answer, and as you can see, the answer is really multiple. The one thing that really jumps out at you is that they are incredibly well adapted to the way we behave. They love human behavior. They love clutter. If you've got a stack of old National Geographic or an LP collection, I'm sort of dating myself, or vast book collection, they love that. Because these creatures spend most of their time hidden away in nooks and crannies in your house, underneath the molding, in the toilet paper roll, behind electrical outlets. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, I live in an apartment and downstairs they've got a problem, well, they'll come up through the cable lines in the floor, or the phone lines, or the pipes. And they are not deterred by things like, so I gave a talk in front of a bunch of exterminator types, and half the room were these kind of nasty exterminator guys, all kind of rude and having fun. And the other half of the room, I was so surprised. I walked in and it was like 50 Hasidic Jews. And I'm going, what? You know, the mix just wasn't working. So as I'm giving the talk, what I learned was that these are all landlords in New York City. And so when I got to the part that said, and you can't really kill them by, let's say a tenant moves out and you lower the heat. And then 6 months later, people move, you get new tenants moving back in. And now you've got a bedbug problem, because the bedbugs will, in a sense, reanimate themselves from their little nooks and crannies where they've been hiding. And now you've got a bedbug problem for the new tenants. And it was like a wave of giant beards, like lowering as these guys all started bumming out. Yeah, you see some really strange things when you're giving talks about blood-feeding creatures to people who are not scientist types. I'll tell you another one later. But all right, so, but I mean, I could go down a list of habits that we have that have sort of all of these things have made the bedbug resurgence happen. For example, people come over your house, you're having a party. Where do they throw their coats? On your bed, yes. Not in my house. No, they put them in a black plastic bag, and I throw the bag out in the backyard, and then they can go, yeah, saves money on parties. Or you go to a place, your child, or you go and you're traveling Europe, your kid's traveling around, and they stay in youth hostels, and they go from place to place to place, and what they bring back in their luggage are souvenirs that are going to literally infest your house. And that's how many people get their places infested. With somebody comes back from a trip, and these creatures are hiding in your luggage. And so I could go down a list of reasons, and many of them are here. And not many of us would pick up a bed from the side of the road. But if you're a student, who knows? But if you're a student or anybody, and you see this really nice bookshelf or a set of dresser drawers out by the curb, you might grab it. Well, if it's infested with bed bugs, you've just brought these creatures into your house, and they will then move out of there and begin to establish their own harborages in your house. So the reason that these are sort of the reasons why, plus the fact that we're much less apt to have people come in and spray insecticide all over everything that we own like they did in the old days. You saw pictures of these guys with these pumps, and they'd come in and spray the baseboards for roaches. Well, they were killing bed bugs as well. And so now the treatment, you can't, in New York City, for example, you can't treat an apartment for bed bugs. You can't pre-treat it. There has to be bed bugs there for you to treat it. It's a law. And so what they're doing now for roaches and other insects is they're laying down baits and traps. Bed bugs feed on blood, only blood. They're not eating bait from a roach trap or an ant trap. So there's been this huge increase in bed bugs, and it's getting worse and worse, and apparently will get is going to get even more serious. So here's my wife thinks I'm completely paranoid, but whenever we go to a hotel or someplace like that, this is what, and I will tell you to do the same thing. So you leave your bags sort of by the door, and you go over to the mattress, as close to the night table as possible. And this corner of the mattress, let's say the night table is here, you peel off the sheet and you peel off the mattress cover, and you look at this corner of the mattress. And if you see little specks, or if you see little poppy seeds with legs, this is a bad thing. And so at that point, I would turn around, grab my bags, and leave that hotel. And it's not just cruddy little junk hotels that have this. It's not just like no-tell motels anymore. In the old days, people used to think, well, only sleazy people are going to get bed bugs. It's not the case. 5-star hotels, magnificent places in Europe and throughout the United States have gotten massive lawsuits because of bed bugs. So this is a problem, and you do not want to get it. And if you do get bed bugs, you really need to have a professional come in, and they have to treat several times. They've got to come back in, because then after they kill the bed bugs the first time, which is wildly difficult, they literally have to take everything you own and put it into pack it into a trailer and then hook up this sort of death gas to exterminate them, and then they take it out like 48 hours later. Meanwhile, that's the only way to kill them except superheat. So if you take them and if you can heat everything you own to 150 degrees, then you're in good shape. Other than that, it's really difficult to kill these creatures. So yeah, you do not want to pick up bed bugs. You don't want to pick up furniture and stuff like that from the side of the road. That's sort of bad juju where I come from. All right, so let's move on and talk about some other critters that are also arthropods, but they're not insects. And these are the chiggers, ticks, and mites. We talked a little bit about them. There's a chigger exhibiting questing behavior. They sort of just wave their little arms, and they've got Velcro, and they're just waiting for you to brush past them. And then they'll latch onto you, and generally look for some type of elastic or something that's binding fairly tight to your body, so they'll get underneath, right where your socks are, or right around where the band of your underpants are. And that's where they make their own little belt of fun. Chiggers are dangerous. Chiggers can transmit diseases that are serious and sometimes life-threatening, so they're nothing to sort of laugh at. You want to avoid them. Let's see. It's unfortunate that you can't see this because they're different than ticks. They don't really burrow into you. The bites itch for 10, 12, 14 days, and that's ridiculously long. And the reason that this occurs is because of the different way that they feed on you. Instead of burrowing in and just like drinking the blood, what chiggers do is they literally will dissolve away your skin into something that is very much like a straw. So it's part of their saliva and part of your body, and you've got this tube leading down into your dermis. And then their saliva, you can think of their saliva as being like acid. They shoot their saliva down this straw, it liquefies your cells, and then they sort of snork it up through this straw, and that's how they feed. So they're not card-carrying blood feeders because they do feed on other material that's not blood, but I thought they were so gross and so cool that I wanted to add them to this book. So the reason that you itch for 14 days is because let's say you flick the mite off, and if you wash yourself, if you take a shower and you use a washcloth, you'll knock the chigger off. They're dead. They're not going to do anything anymore. They're not able to reattach themselves. But what your body is doing is reacting to this foreign structure in your skin, which takes 12, 14 days to dissolve. So you've got the response to this structure is the itch, is the irritation, is the sort of maddening scratchiness that you get. It's called a stylostome for those of you who are taking notes. All right. While we're let's talk a little bit about mites. Oh, and I actually forgot to tell you that chiggers are actually the two larval stages of creatures called mites. And the interesting thing to me is that when these chiggers hit the reproductive stage, when they are adult mites, that many of them are no longer going to bother us anymore. Most of these mites are feeding on things like vegetable matter. It's only during two larval stages, larval instars, that they are feeding on humans. Okay, so along those lines, with regard to mites, there's been a real problem, and you haven't heard too much of it this year, but last year everybody was really concerned about the precipitous drop in bee colonies, and people who were beekeepers were just freaking out because their bee colonies were being decimated, and you had this colony collapse disorder. And what has been implicated in this is among other things, are several species of bee mites that transmit a number of different viral diseases. and the best idea now, the best hypothesis is that these viruses are weakening the bees and may contribute greatly to the colony collapse disorder. All right, ticks. I thought the most interesting thing, everybody in the Northeast is aware of ticks and aware of Lyme disease. And I spoke to, it was actually Tam Signier from Cornell Cooperative Extension. She was terrific help to me in this part of the book. And I found the most interesting thing about ticks was that there's a transition taking place in the Northeast. Classically, we've all been sort of programmed to look for deer ticks. And these are the ticks that are causing the problems. Deer ticks are black-legged ticks. This is causing Lyme disease, so everybody's concerned about deer ticks. Well, in the Northeast, there is, and especially in places like Long Island, where I live, there's a transition taking place now, and the tick that people are getting most often, that they're encountering, is not the deer tick or the black-legged tick anymore. It's a new tick that has moved up from the southwest called the Lone Star tick. And this is a tick that presents its own very unique set of problems. First of all, we don't have a great understanding about what Lyme disease is, and there's an argument back and forth between these two groups of people who are both very, very convinced that they're right. Is there chronic Lyme disease? Yes, there is. No, there's not. So there are things that we don't know about Lyme disease, and now we're throwing something else into the mix, and that's the fact that we're dealing with a new in this area species of ticks. And there are some real differences that are very, very important here. For example, the deer tick it's not a hunter, it's stationary. So it sits very much like you saw that chigger, hangs out on the end of a piece of grass, blade of grass, and you walk by it and it latches onto you, and then from then it looks for a place and settles in and burrows into your skin. That's basically how this works. Now, the Lone Star tick, all right, so because of that, people have set up things like around playgrounds. You'll see a 6-foot mulch 6 foot wide around the playground area because these deer ticks won't cross that mulch to get into the playground. So if you got woods over here, mulch here, playground here, kids are safe. Or it could be picnic tables, whatever. Problem is, with the Lone Star tick is a hunter. It has absolutely no problem at all crossing those mulch barriers. Plus, the Lone Star tick enjoys warmer weather. It is more active during the warm part of the day when it's more likely to encounter humans. The deer tick is more active in the cooler parts of the day when it's less likely to encounter humans. It also transmits diseases that are similar to, but not quite the same as Lyme disease. There haven't been reports. The only difference about this, there's actually a couple more. The only difference with regard to this disease that we can see is that there haven't been reports of it going chronic. The other major difference is that it appears that the Lone Star tick, when it bites, is more painful. So immediately you go, well, that's terrible. Not really, though, because if you could feel this thing bite you, then there's a chance that you can find it before it sets itself in and exchanges. What it's doing is the bacteria are in the saliva, and that's where you're running into problems. So yeah, stay tuned because there's going to be a whole new tick story based on the fact that we've got this new critter to deal with. Oh, and that's a great shot of a tick feeding with a cross in the middle of it. All right, vampire bats. As I said, when I started work at Cornell in 1990, I was lucky enough that 99% of the work that had been done at vampire bats was done on the common vampire bat. And a lot of that work was done here by Bill Wimsatt, and he kept he kept individual bats for up to 20 years. And so when I came on the scene, one of the questions I asked was, well, why doesn't anybody work on the other two vampire bats that we have? And the line that I got from even bat biologists who I really respected, who were these incredible people, the line was something like this: a vampire bat is a vampire bat is a vampire bat. If you study one of them, pretty much the behavior and the anatomy and is going to be very similar with the other two species. And I was learning about things like competitive exclusion, where if you've got two creatures that are similar and they're competing for the same resource, then that doesn't make sense. There's going to be something going on here. One of them is either going to go extinct, or one of them is going to move away, or or it may evolve differences. So that's what I was expecting to see. And at a certain point, a little scientist, a little New Yorker, Arthur Greenhall, took me aside and said, "You know something, kid, you got it. Now go get it." And so John and I went down to Trinidad, brought back 2 of the 3 different species of vampire bats, and the end of the story is basically that we found huge differences. So there are a couple of things that I want to tell you about vampire bats in general first before we talk about what I found as differences. And that is that there are 1,100 species of bats in the world. 1,100. There are 5,000 species of mammals on the planet living today. 1,100 of them are bats. So roughly 22% of all mammal species are bats. Of those 1,100, 3 are vampire bats. 3 feed on blood. And these bats are not found in the United States or Europe, not even Transylvania. They're not found in Russia. They're not found in Asia, Africa. They're not found in the Pacific Islands. The only place that vampire bats are found is in Mexico, Central America, throughout South America, and 2 Caribbean islands, Trinidad, which is where I studied them, and Margarita. And as somebody who was really hot to study anatomy, they are wildly interesting. Any system, any anatomical system that you can pick, from digestive tract to excretory system, really incredible and very, very different than your typical mammal, all because of the adaptations that these creatures have evolved for this blood-feeding lifestyle. So here I was, 99% of the work had been done on 1 bat, and realized that the other 2 bats were very, very different. So in a nutshell, it's this. The common vampire bat, Desmodus rotundus, which is a real problem, feeds on large quadrupedal mammals, things like cattle. So if you trash the rainforest and you bring in this massive herd of cows, then you can support a very, very large population of vampire bats. That vampire bat population is going to explode because of man, not because historically there were great numbers of these creatures. You've got to probably envision that there weren't that many vampire bats in the old days before we came in and hammered the environment. But the common vampire bat is very well adapted to moving around on the ground. It runs around like a little spider. After it feeds, it can make these spectacular leaps, can jump in any direction, does a push-up about 3 feet into the air and flies away. No bats do that. So when I went down to Trinidad, brought back this other vampire bat, I went down and we had set up a force platform, which is a mechanical device that measures the forces that are applied to it when you push down on it. So you can figure if you step down on this plate, it's going to register how much pressure has been applied. So we synchronized this to high-speed cinema, and we were going to look at the differences in jumping behavior between the common vampire bat and this other vampire bat, the white-winged vampire bat. So I got down to Trinidad and we collected the bats, and I explained this to my mentor down there, Farouk Mourad Ali, and I said, well, what I want to do is measure the differences in jumping behavior between these 2 vampire bats. And he goes, your experiment's not going to work. And I went, what? You know, we had built all of this technology, the programming, everything was, all my colleagues and friends that had worked for hours and days and weeks to put this thing together. And I said, what do you mean it's not going to work? And he said, well, the white-winged vampire bat doesn't jump. And I went, oh. And that was sort of the start of what we found out about these creatures, is that the white-winged and the hairy-legged vampire bats don't jump because they don't have to. They're feeding on birds in the trees. If you're feeding from underneath a bird's foot on a branch and you fill up with blood, why do you need to jump? All you need to do is hang from that branch and then fly away. So from there, we found all of these very, very different anatomical specializations that these creatures had, primarily for an arboreal lifestyle, that did not put them into competition with the common vampire bat, which was very common and very well established and just wildly well adapted for what it did. Whereas these bats are rare, even within their own ranges. There's not many of them, and they certainly need to be preserved. Yeah, this is I brought back bats, and a researcher was maintaining a colony out in New Mexico, and what happened was they gave birth, and Newsday down in Long Island ran a contest to name the baby bat. It was the first baby white-winged vampire bat that had ever been born in this country, and Amelia won the contest. I thought Bella should have won. That was mine. Okay, I'll just briefly go through this. I just found some really, really neat adaptations that these creatures had. If you look up there, you can see in that top photo, or that top drawing right there, there's a structure that sort of sticks out from the ankle of bats. It's called a calcar. Well, that calcar is used to spread out the membrane that's between their legs. It's called the interfemoral membrane. And vampire bats, as you can see if this wasn't split, two of the vampire bats don't have this little structure, which I wasn't surprised because they don't have a membrane in between their legs. So why have this little structure? Well, when I looked at the white-winged vampire bat, what I found was they didn't have this wing membrane, but they still had the calcar, only it didn't look like that big honking thing that you see up there. It looked like a finger. And so I called up a colleague of mine, Scott Altenbach, in New Mexico, and I said, you know something? I think these bats are using their calcar for a completely different function, and that is as a sixth digit to climb with, because their five fingers are being used for hanging, and this wrist, literally, ankle bone has now been adapted for a new function, sort of co-opted for a new function. Very much like if you've ever read Stephen Jay Gould's The Panda's Thumb, where a wrist bone looks like a thumb in the panda, but is actually a carpal bone that is used to strip off the leaves from bamboo from bamboo. And so this is just another example. This is instead of the panda's thumb, it was the vampire's toe. And in a sense, what it was is just another example how evolution does not create; it tinkers with what's there. There was something there that wasn't being used, and it was tweaked for a new role, and that's what you see here. All right, finally, the Candiru. This is a creature that normally feeds underneath the opercula, the gill covers of many species of fish in the Amazon River Basin and the Orinoco River Basin in South America. And picture a fish that's about as long as a pencil, maybe a little smaller, same sort of body shape as that, long fusiform thing. And it gets underneath this operculum, sort of weasels its way under there, and it just moves its head back and forth. And on its head, what you find are, you can see those spines there. So there's a goldfish. Of course, this is taken inside a fish tank. It gets underneath there, and you've got this delicate gill membrane, and it moves its head around really quickly and ruptures the membrane. Blood starts to flow. There you can see one before it fed, and so it fills up on the blood, so it's sucking the blood out of the gill membranes underneath the fish. And here you can see those really nasty, spiky structures that it's got that it uses to hook itself onto to the gills of the fish that it feeds on. So that's not the reason why these creatures are notorious in South America. This is. And that's because they are reputed to swim up the human urethra. And so, yeah. It's really funny. I gave this talk in front of 350 pest, exterminator types. So I had all of these guys sitting around me in a big amphitheater the other day, and I got to this part, and I looked out at the crowd, and it was like another wave. But everybody in the crowd just went all at once. 350 like big guys just went, and it was great. So yeah. So yeah, this happens, and so I contacted the person who's probably the world's foremost authority on Candiru, Stephen Spotty, down in Florida, and he told me all of these neat stories, and he showed me the photographs of what happened. This guy in Brazil was urinating in water that was about mid-thigh. And he said he was urinating, and all of a sudden, this thing swam up the urine stream and entered into his penis, and he was suddenly locked in battle with this creature. He's grabbing onto the tail, and he's kind of like, I just sort of envisioned what this must look like from the shore if, you were somebody kind of bathing there, and you're like watching this guy battling his own penis. Well, at the end of the story is that he lost, and this thing secured itself up him, disappeared. And so I'm sitting on the edge of my chair listening to Stephen Spotty tell us, and I'm like bent over a little bit. And I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, he had surgery 3 days later to have it removed. And I went, 3 days later? And he goes, yeah, his abdomen was swollen, from his bladder looked like the size of a soccer ball. and he goes, he was a really tough dude. It's like, yeah, I'd say. Evidently, they removed the thing. You can see it up there. That's after the surgery, and this guy was none the worse for wear afterwards. So now I was completely freaked out, and I said, look, I take my students to the Amazon all the time. First of all, what's happening? He says, what we think is happening is this. When we get rid of nitrogenous waste like ammonia, we do it by urinating. When fish get rid of their nitrogenous waste, they do it through their gills. So what he hypothesized is that these fish are sensing nitrogenous waste like ammonia in the water, and then heading for what they think is fish gill. Well, wrong turn at the urethra is sort of what I call it. And before you know it, this thing's embedded in you and swimming upstream. So then I had John Bertram, who's this biomechanics expert who used to teach at Cornell, and I said, could these things ever swim up? And he reported that he was peeing, and the thing swam up the urine stream like this little salmon from hell. And so he figured things out, and he said, there's no chance that this could ever happen. The guy, this must have happened just so quickly that he didn't realize what was happening. He was sort of dangling in the water. It couldn't have swum up this urine stream. It's biomechanically impossible for this to have occurred. I went, oh, all right. So I felt a little better. And then so I said to Stephen Spotty, the last thing I said to him was, all right, so you gotta help me here. If I'm in the neotropics and I'm in a stream that's infested with Candiru, and I sort of squat down and urinate, what are the odds that a Candiru is going to swim up my urethra? And without missing a beat, he said, about the same odds as being attacked by a great white shark while being struck by lightning. And I went, oh, I can deal with that. So, yeah, so the take-home message is, don't worry, it's probably not going to happen to you unless you're that guy. Yeah, but it's something that happens very rarely. But people down in Brazil just love to scare the crap out of tourists. Oh, yeah, be careful, because we just had one my daughter had. So, yeah, you have to be careful with that. All right, so finally, let's sum up here. All right, the last thing. I was really amazed that if you're dealing with blood-feeding creatures that are as different as ticks or leeches or vampire bats, that they all shared a number of characteristics. And in the field, we call this convergent evolution. It's not like they got these characteristics from some common ancestor. It's that that there's only specific ways, certain ways that you can feed on blood and tap into this wonderful resource, worldwide resource. And there's going to be some similarity in the adaptations that evolved, and that's what I found. So size. The largest strictly blood-feeding creature on the planet is the vampire bat, which weighs in at about 1.5 ounces. Wingspan of about like this. People are expecting like this, that. No, 1.5 ounces. That's the largest vampire on the planet. If you think about it, it's tough to get blood. It'd be tougher to get more blood. So if you're small, you don't need that much blood. Hunting technique, all very stealthy. That makes sense. They want to get in and out without you knowing about it. Dentition, not really teeth in some instances. Leeches don't have what we would call teeth, but they have sharp instruments to access the blood. And whether you're looking at leeches or whether you're looking at vampire bats with their razor-sharp incisors and canines, you're dealing with that. Plus, they all have a way to keep the blood from clotting. If you were to get a vampire bat bite, God forbid, it would be a single little divot-shaped hole, about 1/8 of an inch long, about 1/4 of an inch deep, and this would probably stop bleeding in 2 or 3 minutes if you just left it alone. But what the vampire bats are doing is they have an anticoagulant in their saliva, and they don't really suck blood. Their tongues move in and out like a piston. On the bottom of their tongues, if you saw from that picture back there, there's a groove. So the blood moves up through that groove, just like capillary action. Have you ever seen a capillary tube where someone puts the tube down and the blood sort of moves up into that tube? The same physics going on there. But as they're applying that piston-like tongue to the wound, they're also applying saliva that contains this anticoagulant. So the vampire bat fills up, flies off, or drops away and flies off, and now you've got this wound bleeding for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours. So after a vampire bat feeding, it's a complete mess. Because the creature wakes up, or the person wakes up, and there's this blood everywhere because of the anticoagulants. Much more efficient anti-clotting agent than heparin, and has now, we figured out that this is a great sort of anti-clotting agent for things like preventing or treating strokes. So another reason why we don't want to wipe these creatures out. Finally, these are some conclusions, the ones you can read. Yeah, it's a tough way to make a living, and I've had an interview with Natalie Angier, who I absolutely love, about a month ago, and she said, yeah, but it's a good job if you can get it. And I said, yeah, you're right. And they evolved. These creatures evolved because there's this worldwide resource that they were able to tap into, literally. And there are only several ways, or a couple of ways, to get at this resource. That's what the blocked out one says. And because of that reason, they have evolved separately a number of different characteristics that allow them to get access to this worldwide resource. So we're going to have blood-feeding creatures as long as we have vertebrates walking around with blood. Some of those adaptations have medical significance, like anti-clotting agents, so we should think about conserving these creatures. And finally, stay away from used furniture, especially stuff that you pick up along the curb. Some acknowledgments here. The great photographs were taken by Scott Altenbach, and all of the line drawings in my book, and there were over 50 of them, are by Patricia Wynn. Thanks to my agent at Museum of Natural History and Long Island University. People at Random House are really cool. It's great to have your first book starting at the top with Random House. They're incredible. Special thanks to Ted for having me here and all of the work that he did to get me here. And all my professors and friends at Cornell, and they are, many of them, Howie and Kim. Kim was, if you read the book and you read the chapter about waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning and going to the slaughterhouse to collect blood from the guy who was wielding the Ronco, you know the scene from No Country for Old Men, you know the device that he used to kill people? Here, stand still, pff, that thing. That's what this guy used on cows, and we're there at like 5 o'clock in the morning watching this gigantic cow converted into parts that could be carried off, and we're collecting the blood in big buckets and putting them in Snapple bottles. We always thought that would be a kind of a cool Snapple commercial that never got made. And finally, just as a special thanks to my mentor, John Hermanson. If it wasn't for him taking a chance on me back in 1990, you know, this guy who had sort of, quote, never been challenged scientifically, I wouldn't be here doing this. And all my success, I really have to give him much thanks. So I'll take any questions that you want, and I'm here to sign the book. It looks like we have a book for everyone here today. It's great to be here. Yeah, you were first. Hold on.
One thing I was thinking about with the bedbugs and ticks to some degree is that they have to be very long-lived between meals. How long can they live between?
Well, bedbugs can go for a year without feeding, and leeches as well, which is kind of different biology than vampire bats that have to feed every night. If a vampire bat doesn't feed in 3 nights, it starves to death. So yeah, there's some differences, major differences there. They found that the blood in leeches, for example, isn't broken down very well. So a month after a leech feeds on you, if you look at the blood is live blood. And it hasn't been trashed, it hasn't been busted apart by the animal's digestive system. We think that there's a bacteria that is naturally carried in the guts of the leeches that kills off all of the bacteria that would be involved in the breakdown of the blood vessel, of the blood itself. Strange stuff.
Forgive me if this already has been asked, but the word sanguivore, what does that literally mean? Lazy eater? Because I think of the word sanguine.
Sanguine means blood, right?
Oh.
Sanguine. Piscivorous means eats fish.
I'm probably confusing it with a different word.
Yeah, I just think it means that the sanguine is blood and the ivorous means eating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, Howie?
Yeah, I have a bedbug story.
Uh-oh.
I had never encountered them before the Army, and we went down to Camp Lee, Virginia, and in the morning everybody was itching and there were blood spots all over the bed, you know, and we looked for bedbugs and we couldn't find any. And finally somebody looked in the springs at the end of the, the end of this wire bed, and the bedbugs would run into the springs at the end during the day, and they'd only come out at night. Once we discovered that, we took a candle and went under each spring with a candle.
Huh.
And of course the smell was just terrible, because bedbugs really stink. But after you did your bed like that, all the springs, burned them out, then you put each post of the bed into a can of kerosene.
Huh.
And that kind of isolated you.
There's no smoking in bed.
I guess not.
And then the Army called in one of these gas things like you described, and they gassed the place, I think it was bromine.
Oh, great. That's good for you.
But after 4 days, we moved back in and no bed bug problem.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, the guy at the Museum of Natural History who's the bedbug by Lou Sorkin, the story in the book that I tell is just completely blew me away. He had this little bottle, and inside this bottle is this sort of accordion-shaped piece of cardboard. And he goes, I walk, and the top of the bottle, it's a canning jar. Across the top of the bottle, he's got a hole that's cut about the size of a quarter, and he's got this thin wire mesh across the top of it. So I walk in his office the first time, and he goes, oh yeah, you want to feed my bedbug collection later? And I go, yeah, definitely. So we go through this whole conversation, and he gives me the bottle, and I'm looking at it, and I'm not seeing anything, and I'm like, all right, this is really exciting. He goes, well, cup that bottle in your hands. So I'm holding the bottle. He goes, like you're praying. So I'm holding the bottle like this, and I'm talking to him. About 30 seconds later, he goes, all right, that'll do. So I look at the bottle, and I went, holy shit. And there were a million of these bed bugs, like pressed against the glass, all going like this. And I'm like, I almost dropped this thing. And that's literally what happens at night, is that these things sense your body heat or the carbon dioxide that you're breathing out, and that's what activates them. So at the end of the day, he goes, well, you want to feed those bed bugs? And I go, yeah. So maybe you should show me first. He rolls up his sleeve like this, and I noticed that all along his arm are little circles that are the size of the hole in the top of the jar. And he takes the jar like this, and he goes, and I go, and I'm looking at him, and my jaw is dropping, and he's looking at this like particularly red welt, and he looks at me and he says, well, sometimes I guess I let them feed for a little too long. And suddenly I realized that I had to be somewhere else. I couldn't really take him up on his offer to feed the bed bugs, and I ran out of there. I have to go like find socks for next week. But this guy's sort of renowned now in the world of bed bugs, which is, there are all these blogs and websites. There's the guy who like feeds the bed bugs himself. Yeah, so that's why it was so easy to write this book, because the people that I met were like that, So, any other questions? Well, anybody who'd like to purchase the book, I'm sure that they'd love to sell it to you, and I'd be happy to sign it for you if you're interested. And thank you for coming. It's nice to be here.